Questa cosa. Now we can start. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the second plenary session. I'm Stefania Negri. I'm a PhD student of University of Siena and an ADAPT researcher. I have the pleasure to open this session of ADAPT International Conference, the role of education and training in the social construction of skills and occupations. I'll be chairing this plenary session, which will run from now until 1 o'clock. I'd like to welcome our guests, Professor McNally, Professor Gonon, Professor Dissinger, and Dr. Matteo Colombo. The aim of the second plenary session of this conference is to investigate how education and training have an essential role in creating jobs and developing skills. As Margherita Roiatti explained yesterday, the social construction of labor market and specifically the construction of different types of educations, of occupation is a complex, long and heterogeneous process in which different types of institution, actors and areas play a constant role. In this specific plenary session, we will talk about the role of education and training, not only in the institutional programs of schools and the university in general, but also in programs like apprenticeships that we find in different European countries. Today, we will take a closer look at the development and role of apprenticeships in different national contexts. Apprenticeships and vocational training provide a unique perspective on the social construction of jobs because they are set between school and the labor market, creating a connection between the two systems. Now, let me introduce our outstanding speakers. Professor Philippe Gonon is a professor of vocational training and the Institute of Education Science, University of Zurich. Professor Thomas Dissinger, teaching as a guest professor at the University of Business and Economics in Vienna and the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Professor Sandra McNally is a professor of economics at the University of Surrey. She's a director of Education and Skills Program at the Centre for Economic Performance, London School of Economics. And Dr. Matteo Colombo is a researcher at the ADAPT Foundation on the themes of integration between school, university, and work, and on the history of representation and its transformation. This session starts with the presentation of Matteo Colombo, who will offer a reconstruction of the apprenticeship system in pre-industrial context to rethink apprenticeship in the light of the challenge it faces nowadays. Please.
Thank you, Stefania, and good morning to all. As you can see, the title of my presentation is the social construction of skills and apprenticeship, what lessons from the past. So I will address the topic of this international conference and of this plenary session in particular from the point of view of apprenticeship. Let's start by asking ourselves a question. Is apprenticeship just an instrument of the past, unable to respond to the challenges posed by current social, economic, and technological transformation, or on the contrary, can it be rediscovered today as a tool for the social construction of skills? We think that a lot depends from the point of view we think about apprenticeship. If we think about it just as a contract among the others or as a system. If we think and we regulate apprenticeship as a contract, we consider it just in an individual dimension and is often confused with standard employment. And in many countries, there is also very little training value of this type of contract. And this is, for example, the case of Italy. On the opposite side, if we think about apprenticeship as a system, we think starting from the institutional context, starting from the different ways of collaboration between different institutions, for example, training providers, social partners, employers, public bodies, and they try to combine different purposes, for example, as you can read, social inclusion, training, work, and we can add also innovation. For example, this is the case of the dual system countries, like we will heard after my presentation. What is the proposal? We think that it's possible to trace the origin of this kind of systemic conception, institutional conception, back to the pre-industrial period. Instead, the reduction, or better, the transformation of apprenticeship on a contract among the others with little training context originates with the first industrial revolution and the industrial society, of course with a lot of difference between the different countries. So the proposal I try to argue now is to look back to the past in order to understand how this kind of system worked and understand if and how eventually apprenticeship can change today to meet the challenges that Stefania recalled, so economic, social, and technological challenges. So let's start with the pre-industrial period. In the pre-industrial period, we talk about apprenticeship, and we can talk about one model, but of course with a lot of difference in a different urban and local context. But we can see a contract with different purposes. For example, economic purposes, so to provide masters with low or no cost at all young labor. Educational purposes, so to provide young people with using modern categories we can call technical skills, but also transversal and social skills, and also social purposes, so the enjoyment of civil and social rights, so for example the possibility to open a workshop in a urban context, or also to acquire the social rights in order to stay in that kind of urban context, in that kind of in that city. But if we limit our view to this individual dimension, we cannot see all the richness of the pre-industrial apprenticeship, because we have also to consider the collective dimension of its regulation. So we have to talk about the guilds. the guilds that were collective bodies created by workers that share the same trade, that wanted to protect their market, that wanted to protect their skills. And so shifting to a collective dimension, considering guilds, we can see other purposes. For example, the economic purposes is also to regulate competition between different masters, for example, limiting the number of apprenticeships each master could hire. Or educational purposes, so promote the competitiveness of the craft, starting from the promotion of the skills of the workers, to protect the skills of the workers and so protect the quality of the trade. Social purposes, so we have to think that in pre-industrial period there was a school, so apprenticeship had also a lot of educational purposes, not just training purposes. And it's quite interesting that only in this collective dimension we can see another purpose, the innovative one. So, as I wrote, the social control of the spread of innovation. In Middle Ages, innovation was incremental in nature, and it was dependent on the skills of the workers, not just on the technology. So, for example, if we wanted to innovate a trade, we just have to attract artisans, attract skilled workmen to our place, to our city, because it was the skills. It was the skills and the competence of the worker that was the main driver on innovation, not just technology alone. One might say that maybe it's like today, that the human capital is really important for the promotion of innovation, not just the technological one. And what was the role of the guilds in this kind of problem, in the problem of attract skills workmen and promote innovation? Guilds with local bodies, with local powers, promote the recognition of license and patents to skilled workers, to artisans that comes from abroad, and they give them monopoly powers. But in exchange, this kind of artisan workers had to share their knowledge, share their secrets, the secrets of the trade, with young local people, with apprenticeship. So apprenticeship was a tool for the social control of the spread of innovation. Guilds controlled the innovation in order to protect the masters and the market power of the master, but favored the spreading of innovation at a local context thanks to the training of young people. So that's the pre-industrial period, and for reason of time, I can now only focus on two factors that can help us understand the story after the pre-industrial one. And the first factor now I recall is the creation of labor market. We are talking today in these days of the social construction of market, that we have here a perfect example, because as we know, thanks to, for example, authors like Polanyi or Tannenbaum, market are a social construction, and in modernity we see the aim of the construction of a new kind of labor market, where apprenticeship doesn't fit anymore, because there is the constant attention to reduce all the contract to the standard employment, to the standard regulation model of employment. So that kind of contract, the apprenticeship one, doesn't fit anymore in this kind of system, and it is reduced years by years, and experience by experience, of course, in different ways in different countries, like we will heard, to a normal contract, from apprenticeship to normal employees. And training in a lot of countries is expelled from a work context. We see here a separation between work and training. And the other factor is the abolition of the guilds, and I think that it's quite interesting that Adam Smith told us that the guilds was an economic inefficient institution, but the reason about the abolition of guilds was just not economic one, but more political and cultural reason, because there was the aim to promote a new kind of society, not just to make the market more efficient, but to create a new social order. So when we talk about guilds and we talk about social partners and we talk about intermediary bodies, we talk about different ideas of society, not just different modes to regulate the market. So the apprenticeship, of course, is transformed with this kind of changes, and two new actors enter the field to gain control of the institution, because with the abolition of guilds, also the institution that promoted the regulation and the diffusion of apprenticeship was abolished. And the state and the social partners starts to collaborate in some countries, like we will learn, or to try to take control of the apprenticeship system. And moving faster, we see that in the last 2 centuries, for example, thanks to all the studies related to the skill formation system that are a typical type of study that concentrate their attention on the institutional setting of different countries and focus, for example, on the role of the state and the role of employers in promoting vocational education and training, VET, and also apprenticeship. In fact, for example, to the metrics you can see that is proposed by Busmayer and Trampusch, we can see 4 different models. Liberal countries, like England, with a low commitment by the state and also by employer in promoting VET and apprenticeship. Segmentalist countries, where there is a weaker role of the state, but a strong commitment by employers, and is, for example, the case of Japan. But some recent research told us that also Germany is moving in this direction. Statalist countries, like, for example, France, with a strong commitment by the state, but a low commitment by employers, and collective skill formation system. So the countries of the dual system, like Germany, Switzerland, Austria, where we can see a strong commitment and also a strong collaboration between state, social partner, employers. What we can see now, that we can see that in a collective skill formation system, it is possible to trace the continuation of that kind of systemic approach. So approach that promote the collaboration and the and the participation of different partners, of different stakeholders, in order to build from below a system of skill formation, thanks to apprenticeship. Whereas in other countries, that's, for example, the case of Italy, apprenticeship is often reduced just to a contract. But even in the countries of the so-called dual system, so for example Germany, Switzerland, Austria, we can observe now a retreat from that kind of collective logic I've tried to describe, of that kind of systemic logic, especially when the step back is made from the social partners. So there is the risk that also in this kind of countries, also in collective skill formation countries, there is a risk of a limited role of the social partners. So we can see a different evolution of apprenticeship from the first industrial revolution in different countries, of course, following different institutional arrangement, different cultural history, of course. But today we can see that also the countries that have promoted a systemic logic in order to protect skills, in order to protect skilled workers, are changing, and that kind of logic, that kind of collective and systemic logic is in decline. So concluding my presentation, what we can learn, what we can try to learn from this kind of reconstruction and this the past I've tried to briefly reconstructing. So for regain that kind of systemic logic in a period like this one, where we can see the development of the knowledge economy, when we can see different type of employment, when we can see the impact of technological innovation. We talk a lot about the digital and green transition. Let's just turn back to the first question. What about apprenticeship? Is just a tool from the past, or we can rethink it? And we think that we can rediscover that kind of systemic nature following 4 hints. The first one is the return to the collective, return to trades, return to reevaluate the skills connected to occupation. Also rethinking trade unions, also rethinking the mode of organizing employer associations, so rethinking also the role and the identity of collective bodies. For example, thinking about occupational communities that we are talking in these days, a mode of organize workers not around a trade, but around a craft, around a group of skills, in order to rediscover this kind of identity and connect and link identity to skills. The second point is to promote apprenticeship also as a system in order to promote the acquiring of skill certificate that are valued by the labor market and maybe necessary to exercise some type of professional roles, but also linked to educational degree. So rethink also the connection between the educational institution and apprenticeship in order to rediscover the link between these two kind of words. And the third one is also to rediscover the use of apprenticeship as a tool for the social control of innovation. We are seeing now the example of the green transition. Why we are not seeing, for example, a strategy, a system that links together investment in technology and investment in skills, investment in apprenticeship that are linked to the new green technology, to the new green skills, in order to promote that kind of integration I tried to describe before. And the last point is that if we think about guilds, of course, we cannot make a simple parallel to today's words, but they are more similar to the occupational communities I mentioned before. And the last point is that maybe we can also go after the limitation of the apprenticeship to the standard employment contract and promote its use also for example, non-standard type of employment or autonomous employment. So, concluding, I think that the challenge now is to abandon some industrial categories we have inherited from the past and start to think again about apprenticeship, rediscovering that kind of systemic approach that is the only way, I think, to promote social inclusion, vocational excellence, and economic and social sustainability. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matteo, for your interesting presentation and the important emphasis of the role of the social partner in this process. Now, the next speaker is Professor Philippe Gonon, who will talk about the political, social, and pedagogical foundation of German-speaking VET, the case of Switzerland.
Yes, thank you for this invitation. My presentation is focused on a Swiss case, vocational education and training in Switzerland, apprenticeships in Switzerland. And my view is more a historical one, and my focus is also on the legislation and the legitimation of the system. Tradition of the dual apprenticeship means that apprenticeships were never abolished in Switzerland. And in contrary, it was more or less a reinvention of apprenticeships. This means dual apprenticeships, 3 days in the plant or in the firm for an apprentice, and 1 or 1.5 or 2 days in school. And that is the so-called dual apprenticeship, the duality. And so you have to have in mind that the dual apprenticeship also developed besides or together with the school system in 19th century. And another aspect is also the nationalization of apprenticeships. Apprenticeships started in branches, in specific workshops, in local regions. And what happened in 19th and in 20th century was some kind of a national standard, a national also common currency, you could say. So this is the focus. But let me start with the Swiss case. You see, Switzerland is a federalist country, 26 small states, very small states, cantons. It's 4 languages, and also very diverse with mountain regions. Perhaps a lot of you know this from skiing and other, but also cities like Geneva, Basel, Zurich. And this system, nevertheless, has a common currency. As I said, the school system is organized like this. If you see on this slide, there are a lot of people engaged in dual track programs, in dual apprenticeship, a smaller part in vocational and education programs, but only school-based, and a baccalaureate school, which is quite modest related to other countries, if you see this kind of graph. So Switzerland has a high engagement in education. The system was quite tracked. Baccalaureate schools and had a very elitist, or still have some kind of an elitist selection. And the system is, however, nowadays very permeable. 10 most frequently chosen apprenticeships today, in former times, this top 10 looked very differently, but today it's commerce, healthcare, retail, social care workers. So you see, it's a service industry, Switzerland nowadays. IT technician, electrician, cook, draftsman are on a very much lower level today. So normally that also was something for young people, 15 to 18 years old. Today it's some kind of a little shift towards also that adults can join such apprenticeship programs. The Swiss system, here I made some kind of a graph. It was my own design I tried to put in. And yes, when I presented this in another occasion in Harvard, people said me, oh, it looks like a Swiss clock. It's very, and yes, perhaps this is not so wrong. And my answer was, yes, a Swiss clock, but there was no watchmaker behind. So it is more or less, it evolved out of different strands or tracks. And you see these arrows, that means there are also possibilities to move on in the system, in the vocational education system, or from the vocational system into other parts. Today, as I said, a lot of people young people are really doing a dual apprenticeship, 63% at the age of 15 to 18. It's a very high quota. And as you see, we tried to reconstruct the development of this data, you see that the apprenticeship nearly, that's a line from 1900 to 2020, it's going up and up. Although there were a lot of also challenges. And also the red line, that is for whole Switzerland, and the regional differences are nevertheless of interest. If you see the green line, this is the canton of Geneva. There, the numbers of vocational trainees, of apprentices, declined. And in Ticino, the Italian-speaking part, as well, it is on a lower level. Meanwhile, in Zurich, it is rising and rising. So the different cantons have different kinds of apprenticeship rates. So, as I said, Zurich, from 1940 to 2019, the data is still rising of the apprenticeships. Meanwhile, the baccalaureate schools, the green line, is on a much lower level, and the school-based vocational education and programs are on an even lower level. In Geneva, it's differently. The green line, the baccalaureate schools, they are very important. They have play an important role, but also the school-based vocational education programs. And in Ticino, once more, it's a bit different. The green line is also raising the baccalaureate schools, but also the school-based vocational education programs. So the simple message of these three graphs is just that there are really huge regional differences in the development and also in the policy, how to foster apprenticeships. When young people reached the age 25, there were, if you see the cantons, quite different also shares of diplomas of first degrees. For Switzerland as a whole, 90% or 91% of youngsters with 25 have a degree, either a baccalaureate or an apprenticeship degree. And this is also very different in different parts. If you see especially the, do I have a point or something? Not really? Okay. If you see the cantons on the right side of the slide, that is Ticino, Neuchâtel, Geneva, the quota is much lower of youngsters who have accomplished the first degree. And this is a bit related also to the fact that the baccalaureate schools play a more important role, like in Geneva, and the apprenticeship model and the vocational education track is much lower, as you see on this graph. So there is, it plays a role how the system is organized in the cantons. What I'm presenting here is just some developments related from 2000, from the millennium to 22. You see the highest degree of the population, highest level of education of a mandatory school level is declined from 60% to 11 or 10.7. The secondary 2 level, the highest degree, a vocational or a baccalaureate degree, has also declined from 59% to 44%. And what is interesting is the tertiary level. That means university of applied sciences, higher professional vocational education degrees. This quota raised from 24% to 45%. In a quite a recent development, you can see that Switzerland is moving towards a more academically or on a higher level educated society. So I'm also sticking to some kind which is called the path dependency approach, the evolution of the Swiss system. The system was in 19th century and till recently quite a separate system, the vocational education system, related to the other parts of the education system. And the foundation of a formalized qualification model, including work-based learning in schools, started in 1930. That was the first federal law upon vocational education and training. And this law was, as I know you are a lot of lawyers are here, or law science people, you could refer it as a law, a framework law, a very broad defined law with a lot of possibilities really to shape specific also programs and schedules inside vocational education. So the first federal law on vocational education, in my view, it's the first law in the world which was really defined for vocational education in 1930. And this was renewed in 1963, 1978, and 2004. So our vocational education and training system still is based on the law of 2004. And as I said before, specific schedules are possible, like hybrid qualifications, which are in a program which is called Federal Vocational Baccalaureate. That means that it is possible to learn an apprenticeship and acquire also academic subjects. And this is an entrance for moving on to the University of Applied Sciences. So education now is even defined in the Constitution of Switzerland. In the constitutional law, it is especially mentioned that Switzerland has to be seen as an educational space. And this means that all parts which are engaged in education should also work together. The constitutional law is also important for guaranteeing some kind of a permeable program. And it is including higher education, further education, and vocational education and training. And the specific aspect is also said that all actors have to take care of the quality of vocational education and training. So the common concerns of the actors is to strengthen that vocational education and training, and specifically the apprenticeship model. And this is some kind of a long-term project, and it is more or less some kind of a strategic alliance, as it is said in the political economy literature. A strategic alliance means that all actors, unions, but also the entrepreneurs, but also left parties and right parties, they have often different opinions about a lot of things, but in the case of vocational education and training, they are working or cooperating together. And that's a very important element. That is also included in the Swiss, I would say, culture of compromise, of finding compromises, of trying to find a solution for diverse interests. So trade associations, Swiss unions, social welfare associations, teacher associations, they are all working together. And this is also the result, is some kind of legal framework. And this helps also to establish, I would say, these are my words, a hybrid system, which includes neo-corporatists, but also academic regimes. Hybridization and permeability, these are the elements which are moving forward the dual apprenticeship, also the apprenticeships. And this is one also of my, would say, key messages, that apprenticeships are a concept in flux. They are not a stable concept. They are also changing. They are transforming themselves. Quality in this sense is also trying to offer differentiating programs to make the system attractive, to combine it with labor market qualifications and study abilities. This option is also an option which is an option for young people, that they know if I start an apprenticeship, it doesn't mean that I'm doing a dead-end education, but it is a possibility to move on. So we have, nevertheless, I would say, also some problems in a way in the vocational education and training system. This is also linked to the kind of academic drift. It is a worldwide drift towards academy. A lot of parents, they stress, I would like to get my child in a high school, in a baccalaureate school, and this happens also in Switzerland, the paradise of vocational education and training. And that's why it is important that the dual apprenticeship and the vocational education and training is also a bit adapting to this development, and the education policy is trying to keeping the system alive. To insofar they offer new apprenticeship and offer new pathways into higher education, and also trying to develop dual apprenticeships further. So this slide is also perhaps another aspect. I always speak now about moving forward and towards academy, but there is also the aspect of inclusion. Originally, vocational education and training was also in Switzerland designed for integrating working class and people who are not so well off, not having the privileges. In the 70s, there was some kind of a change that also young people with specific needs had possible entrance paths. That means reduced programs, 2 years apprenticeships, and even today with refugees and also with other people, there are programs which try to integrate also people from minorities, ethnocultural backgrounds, refugees, and also to surrender the gender stereotypes in vocational education and training, which exist in vocational education and training quite severe. So there are female professions and male professions, and this is also a topic which is a challenge. So let me conclude. Differentiation and hybridization is a way how to keep the dual apprenticeships and the vocational education and training system alive, to react or to respond to rising demands for formally higher qualifications, for also get an answer for the aspirations of young people to get a high degree. Offering these new kinds of pathways, inventing new forms of vocational education and dual apprenticeships, and transferring also the vocational principle to higher education. So policy should be more active in including young people in vocational education, also with specific needs. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonon, for your important presentation and for showing of the evolution and function and trends of the Swiss VET. Now, Professor Thomas Diesinger will talk about skill formation in the dual system, institutional feature and specific role of not-state stakeholder in the social construction of skills.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. And I will talk about the dual system of Germany. And there are a lot of similarities to Switzerland, but also many differences. Our apprenticeship system was also never abolished, and it was never really jeopardized by by educational or political aspirations. It's a mix of regulation and tradition. That's what I would like to show you in my presentation. One difference to Switzerland is that we have a federal political system in Germany as well, but the apprenticeship system is a centrally regulated system. So we have a Vocational Training Act, which goes back to 1969, and it was modernized twice, once in 2004 and in 2005, and 2020. So we have a vocational act which was made later than in Switzerland. Now this is my table of contents. I will first present you the German VET context very briefly, not in detail, because I would like to talk about the apprenticeship system in detail with three perspectives on the system in my second and the largest part of my presentation, then two major challenges for the system, which are a bit similar than as in Switzerland. First of all, some statistics of VET in Germany. When we talk about the dual system, we talk about roughly 1.4, actually 1.35 million young people in 2021 that entered the system. Not entered the system, the total number was 1.35. So roughly 400,000 per year enter the system, mostly in 3-year courses in different sectors of the economy. Besides, we have a full-time vocational school system or a school-based system with different functions. To this system, the health occupations, for example, belong, which are not part of the dual system formally. So we talk here about 1.15 million students in 2021. On the other side, we have 3 million students in higher education now in Germany, which is quite high. And this is there has been a rising number in the last couple of years. It's now stagnating on this high level at the moment. One of the problems is that we can observe a decline of apprenticeships in recent years. For example, between 2019 and 2021, the number of young people seeking an apprenticeship went down by nearly 60,000. That's quite a large decline. So this is one of the permanent problems in the system. I will come back to this later on. Why is it called a dual system? Similar to Switzerland, we talk about the companies and the vocational part-time schools that share responsibilities, activities in the system, and they train young people in currently 323 so-called training occupations. In the dual system, the share of the company, of course, is much larger than the share of the school. So we talk about 1.5 days on average in the school, and the rest of the time apprentices spend in the company. But it's called a dual system, although it's not strictly dual, of course. And we also have an academization development in our system. But on the other hand, we have a very interesting figure which you might not know. When we talk about the school leavers that go to the dual system, we have quite a large number of young people who have either Abitur, which is the normal high school qualification, or a qualification enabling them to go to a Fachhochschule, a University of Applied Sciences. And this percentage now is at 30%. So 30% of our apprentices have this academic background, but they decide to go to the dual system. This is a very positive message. The negative message is that we have a skill shortage in our economy, and we have a declining demand in total in the dual system from the side of school leavers. But we have still a high share of people with Abitur and Fachhochschulreife. This is quite interesting, and I think this is different on Switzerland, this figure. Yeah. Now, what are the features and working principles in the dual system? First of all, it's an apprenticeship system. It's a basic learning and training model accompanied by a school based on 2 learning sites now. That's why it is called dual. I mentioned the Vocational Training Act already, which is our national act regulating apprenticeships in Germany, and we have 16 school laws besides, because Germany is a federal republic, and the federal states, they have the unquestioned competence, legal competence, constitutional competence to care for the school system and the university system. So we have a split legal system, but here we have a national apprenticeship law, if you want. For training in the apprenticeship system, companies need to employ a trainer or master craftsman. That's also prescribed by the law. And of course, we also have a more or less highly formalized teacher training system in the VET context. So, for example, our course in Konstanz is a typical course in business education, and about 70% of our graduates later on work in a commercial school, either in the dual system or in a full-time school. Then one speciality is that the chambers have a very strong institutional role in the system. They are supervising and examining bodies for in-company training. The training regulations, I underlined this with red color here. The guideline for the training occupations or training regulations is the vocational principle. So we train in occupations, not just in competences, not just in modules. It's a holistic concept. I will talk about this in a minute. And we also have a collective responsibility in the system with the social partners, the trade unions, and the employer organization when it comes to defining what a training occupation should contain, how a training occupation needs to be changed and adapted to technological changes, what kind of scheme should be created for a specific family of occupations. So we had a lot of different reorganization procedures since the 1980s, actually, in Germany, in different fields, including IT occupations, metal occupations, where the two partners actually sometimes had controversial, different opinions about how the training occupation should be organized. So it's also a consensus principle which is contained in this VET system in Germany. Different from Switzerland, there is no direct progression normally to higher education from the apprenticeship system. So you either need to already have the university entrance qualification after your training, or you have to go to maybe to a vocational course and upgrade your qualification. In some federal states, we have a more liberal approach. In our federal state, in Baden-Württemberg, is still quite traditional, restricted. So we don't have this hybridity in the apprenticeship system. But we have a lot of qualifications which young people can get in the full-time vocational school system to upgrade their school qualifications. That's also an important feature of the German system. Now, against this background, I found this quotation by Paul Ryan, who is a very famous researcher of apprenticeships from Cambridge. He said the German apprenticeship system, or my perspective is the German apprenticeship system comes very close to what he calls a broad definition of the term, as here, I quote Ryan, apprenticeship denotes programs of learning that combine part-time formal education in the vocational part-time school with training and experience at the workplace and result in an externally recognized vocational qualification, which is not just valid for the company in which the young person trains, but it's a nationally recognized vocational qualification. And that has got to do with holistic approach and the notion that we have uniform training occupations for any companies that want to train in this occupation in the whole of Germany. So we have quite a universal approach to this vocational or occupational principle. So the core elements of the vocational principle are as follows. It's a really holistic concept of skills. There's a high degree of formalization, although there are a lot of traditional elements in the dual system in Germany. There's a high degree of formalization going back to the Vocational Training Act of 1969. There's fixed training duration for everybody training in a specific occupations, and we have formal examinations with the chambers, And the chamber certificate is the relevant occupational qualification, not the school certificate. So the school comes second in this system. It's a subsidiary partner, if you want, compared to the company. Companies are very important, chambers are very important, and employers and trade unions are very important as stakeholders in the system. These qualifications in the training occupations in Germany are supposed to be portable on occupational labor markets. So employers, they have a specific demand for people, and they look out for the apprenticeship belonging to this specific work or occupational area. This does not mean that in Germany we do not have other labor markets as well. We also have precarious labor markets, and we have a low-level labor market segment as well. But when we think of the apprenticeship system, we still believe that the occupational orientation should be very, very important and should be really politically supported in any case. And the trade unions have a major interest in this, especially. And the holistic concept of the vocational principle also contains the notion of underpinning knowledge and workplace skills which go hand in hand. That's why the vocational part-time school plays a very important role in the dual system, although it's not the major institution. Now I now will present you three perspectives on the dual system in the German context, summarizing what I have already worked out. First of all, as a system of initial training, the German dual system is based on the learning and training model of apprenticeships. And this is the traditional component in the system, including this concept of vocation or occupation, which I have just depicted. Secondly, as it is called dual, that's the conventional name we use for the German system, dual system. As it is called dual, it depends on the responsibility and commitment of companies and vocational schools, despite their different functions in the process of skill formation. So there's not a high level of cooperation between these two training sites, although we call it a dual system. Yeah? And thirdly, as a collective skill formation system, this term was already mentioned by Matteo, collective skill formation system, its functionality depends on a complex framework around these two learning sites of shared responsibilities and functions of both state and non-state, private and public stakeholders, including the chambers, the trade unions, employer organizations. And that's why I mentioned earlier on, it's a mixture of regulation coming from the state and tradition, which is more or less represented by these non-state stakeholders. Now, I'm picking out the role of the chambers now in the system to illustrate the role of these non-state bodies, and sometimes we call them intermediate bodies because they are located between companies and the government, companies and the state. In the Vocational Training Act, we call the chambers competent bodies, zuständige Stellen, competent bodies, and they are basically, legally speaking, self-government organizations. And this goes back to the various draft regulation acts and the Act for the Industry and Chamber System, both after the war, after the Second World War, but even back to the 19th century. So the chambers in Germany have these basic functions. They registrate the training contracts. They register the training contracts. So they have a similar function to the traditional guilds. They supervise training in companies. So it's not the state, which is the institution where you can complain as an apprentice. You have to go to the chamber. And the chamber is the relevant supervising body of training in companies, not in school, but in companies. They counsel companies in various areas, including continuing training, but also when companies want to start training or have problems with their training infrastructure or with their training qualifications and so on. They also organize continuing training, so the master craftsman qualification and the training qualification, a trainer's qualification for the dual system lies in the hands of the chambers in Germany. And of course, they are examining bodies for apprenticeships. And also, as a roof organization, the chamber system in Germany is a very important part of the VET policy context in Germany. So they are also representatives of the economy, not just these intermediate institutions. It's quite a complicated legal construction, which has a long tradition in Germany, actually. And this is my next point. Actually, the dual system is not something which was invented on a drawing board. It's a historical cultural result of developments, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, but even also after the Second World War, when the system became more standardized than before the war. And one important historical step was economic policy in the late 19th century, and with it the rediscovery of the ancient craft concept of apprenticeship, which became protected by the state, by law in Germany. So we have a very important act in 1897, the so-called Craft Protection Act, Handwerkerschutzgesetz, which was addressed to the craft sector. And in this act, the establishment of guilds and chambers, formalized training contracts, and trainer qualifications were stipulated in 1897. So at the climax of industrial development in Germany, the social policy context and the educational policy context looked back to the old order, looked back to the pre-industrial age, if you want. Another development concerns the vocational part-time school. That's a more or less separate development because it was triggered by state activities, but also by important educational reformers. That's why we have a vocational theory tradition in Germany, and this was accompanied by the state activities to care for compulsory attendance in continuation schools. They were called continuation schools until 1920. Later on, in Germany, we speak of Berufsschulen, part-time vocational schools. So after 1920, this vocational part-time school became more or less firmly established in Germany. And Georg Herschensteiner, he's one of these educational reformers. He was the leading educational thinker behind this development of the vocational part-time school. And he had in mind that vocational part-time schools should be places of vocational education and training, but also of the education of the state citizen, of the Staatsbürger. Yeah? So he had a very holistic notion of how apprentices should be trained, not just in the company, but also in a school, like in general education in a way. And then thank you. Another important historical step is the establishment of the chamber principle in industry in the late 1920s. So the industrial companies adopted the same institutional structure as the craft sector, although they also gave other impulses into the system development besides this institutional aspect. So the system experienced a kind of universalization in the first decades of the 20th century. Now I'm coming back to the craft sector. I mentioned the Craft Protection Act. When you look at the figures relevant for the craft sector, you can see that the contribution of the craft sector in the training system is quite high. So when we look at the number of companies, in Germany, 30.5% of companies are craft companies, small, medium-sized companies. They employ 12.4% of employees, but they employ nearly 30% of apprentices in Germany. And that underlines this traditional approach, which is actually very visible in the craft sector in Germany. And this alludes to this historical component, this historical development which I mentioned. So we can speak about the dual system as a very stable system, despite many problems in the system. We can speak of its historical stability, and it survived actually the turmoils of the 20th century, including the two world wars, of course, and even the 1960s and 1970s, when we had a very strong critical educational movement, not just in Germany, but mainly in Germany, who wanted to abolish the system, actually, in favor of a school-based led system. Even this educational movement did not lead to a basic questioning of the system. So it survived even the 1960s and 70s, let alone the two world wars. So all in all, we can say, without ignoring the problems in the system, employers, trade unions, and chambers have proved their commitment to apprenticeships and kept the stability of the system. And that's why I would like to come back to your point about contract and system. I would say that the apprenticeships in the dual system are more than just a contract, definitely. When looking at this institutional context and at the vocational principle and the vocational school, they are a system, though not in the meaning of system theory, which would mean that we have one leading principle. This is not the case. We have many different principles and components in the system which make it a system in this understanding, as a contrast to the word contract. Now, challenges, just 2 slides. Actually, the first slide alludes to the training market situation in Germany. You can see different colors, and the red colors actually indicate that the supply-demand ratio is below 100, so we have too few apprenticeships available on the market. But you see, the majority of regions has an oversupply of apprenticeships. So young people could theoretically select among different apprenticeships in different regions. So this indicates the skill shortage situation in the German economy when we look at apprenticeships in detail. There are more apprenticeships available than young people who look for apprenticeships, and this is a big problem for the next years and decades in Germany. And this has also, not exclusively, got to do with academization, which was mentioned by Philip as well for Switzerland. And when we look at the academization development in Germany, we can say 2013 was the break-even point when, for the first time, we had more new students in universities and other higher education institutions than in the apprenticeship system. And since then, there are more students in higher education than in the apprenticeship system. This is also our challenge. Although, on the other hand, I mentioned the 30% of apprentices that have this qualification, which would enable them to go to universities. Yeah, so it's a bit a paradox, actually. Yeah, when we look at these figures. Okay, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this German point of view of this important issue. And now our last speaker for this session, Professor Sandra McNally from University of Surrey. Professor McNally will talk about the social construction of skills in England with the particular case of apprenticeships. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, England is so different from the 2 cases that we've just heard. It's the opposite of stable, I would say. It's the opposite of stable in terms of the vocational system. It's changed many times, and unfortunately, apprenticeships that used to be quite a strong part of the United Kingdom. It did decline a lot. There have been various attempts by the government to try to increase apprenticeships, and ideally I think they'd love to just import the apprenticeship system of Germany or Switzerland, but unfortunately you can't do that. And I think a difficulty with any country wanting to do that is because there's so much about it that's to do with your institutions, the way that institutions are set up in a country, and it can be very difficult to get from where you are to what you want to be if that isn't there. Another kind of important difference as well is that there isn't much occupational licensing really in England, and I think when that's absent, people can work in occupations without having an apprenticeship, so that weakens it as well relative to countries where occupational licensing is very important. So I'm going to give I probably won't give my whole presentation because it's too long for the time, maybe a bit off topic, some of it as well. So I'll try and keep within the time so people can have their lunch. So I'm just going to run through a few things about England. Well, I just put the definition of what the government say an apprenticeship is in England, bearing in mind that there are differences between countries in this. But in essence, it's similar to what apprenticeships are in what we've heard in Germany and in Switzerland, at least in principle. It should be about entry to a recognised occupation. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be your first job. A lot of people in England will do apprenticeships within the job, within the company, within the job they already have, and that the apprenticeship will be training for a new role within that. That's very common within England. So it's not primarily from the school to work transition, and that's the way people think of it still, but it isn't in practice what it is in England a lot of the time. There has been major changes recently. The focus is now off qualifications as such. You get a certificate at the end, and that should be your nationally recognised certification that enables you to work in an occupation. I'll say more about that. There's an independent endpoint assessment, that's how it's assessed, and there's a huge focus in anything you read about this on employer-led apprenticeships. So unfortunately, we don't have those strong chambers that we just heard about in Germany, in England. So it's really employers getting together in a very sort of in a way that isn't very clear how that comes about, but they have to be groups of at least 10, and then they approach the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education and discuss setting up an occupational standard. So it is quite loose as to how people become apprenticeships. So it's not as broad a concept of occupation as in, for example, Germany. But I'll say more about that later. There has been a massive expansion over the last 15 years, and it is a core part of government policy in this area. Apprenticeships are available at different levels. The most common are intermediate level 2 apprenticeships, so they're notionally equivalent to the lower secondary qualifications that you get at age 16, the GCSEs, if you're familiar with the English system. That would be the notional equivalent. So it isn't particularly high as a level at all. In 2012, there was a new regulation saying that these apprenticeships had to last for a minimum of 12 months. Before that, they were actually shorter than that. So that's so different from what we hear about in other countries. But people often don't just do one apprenticeship. They can do a level 3. You can use their intermediate apprenticeship, do an advanced apprenticeship afterwards. And an advanced apprenticeship is notionally equivalent to the upper secondary qualifications. In some areas, it's easier to make that transition from intermediate and advanced than others. In some occupations, there would be natural progression, whereas in other occupations there wouldn't be. And then there's been a recent growth of what's considered higher in degree apprenticeships, and they would be more tertiary level apprenticeships. And in fact, degree apprenticeships are when a person comes into the firm, they actually have they get the university degree as well as the apprenticeship, and they can be quite long as a result. So quite probably I don't think that exists elsewhere, and there are of course difficulties with it because you have to stay with the company for potentially quite a long time, and it's also quite expensive because the government is funding the provision. They are funding for the provision of the training, and in universities that's quite high. So I would say apprenticeships in England are a job with some training more than training. It's not, the emphasis is more the job. It's not necessarily the training. As I said, it isn't primarily aimed at those entering the workplace for the first time, and a huge emphasis placed on employers. And there have been several important changes in recent years. I'll say more about that later, but there are currently 783 apprenticeship standards, and that contrasts with 323 training occupations that you mentioned in Germany. So it's completely different. This is what's happened to the number of apprenticeships over recent years. So the graph on the left-hand side, my left-hand side, just shows what happened between 2003 and 2016. And you can see a really big increase amongst 25-year-olds because the government allowed older people to become apprenticeships in the 2000s, in the mid-2000s, and that was a lot of the increase in apprenticeships. That's behind a lot of the increase in apprenticeships. You can see that in recent years, that's the graph on the right-hand side, there's been a drop-off in the number of apprenticeship starts, particularly around 2017, 2018. And that is to do with the introduction of what they call standards instead of previous frameworks. So there's been a major change in apprenticeship policy, and also a change in how apprenticeships are funded. And if I characterize the changes, I would say apprenticeships now are more rigorous, more higher quality than they used to be, and tougher for employers, in that they definitely have to provide 20% off the job training. That was a little fuzzy perhaps in the past. And that will probably have put off employers from taking on apprentices. On the positive side, it would have got rid of a lot of the dodgy ones. So when you see the fall in the numbers, you have to remember that some of them, the ones that were previously provided, probably not very high quality. And then, of course, data here only goes up to 2020, and there was the effect of the pandemic when you saw a lot of apprenticeships just go because of that. So this is what's happened to big changes in composition. So I mentioned before 2017 was around that time of quite a few big policy changes, especially the change from frameworks to standards. And you can see major changes in composition as well. So a fall off of the level 2, that's the low level apprenticeships, where you would think that might be quite a lot of low quality in that group, and they fell off. You can see a huge increase in level 4 plus apprenticeships, so they're kind of higher tertiary type apprenticeships in recent years. And that may be considered a good thing. It's highly, it's a contentious issue. On the one hand, you might think, well, that's good. People can have a longer apprenticeship with a longer duration, with more content in it. The disadvantage of them is that a lot of them are in business, and people think our companies are just using the government's incentives to substitute for what they were previously doing, and that maybe some of these management type apprenticeships aren't good quality. So there's lots of concern about that. The other concern about that is they're also quite expensive, and they're not going to young people necessarily. They're going to older people. So if you think apprenticeships should be more directed at younger people, that's certainly where the higher returns are in the economic sense. That's also controversial as well. This just shows you the sector composition of apprenticeships. That's been relatively stable. So the biggest one is business and administration. Health and care is another big one. Engineering and manufacturing is a particularly a good one, in the sense it gives people it does have quite high quality apprenticeships in that sector and very high returns for the people who do them. and this is the composition by age group. So you can see that a lot of apprentices are over 25 years old, and that's been the case now for several years. So frameworks and standards are used to describe the content of an apprenticeship, including skills and how they will be assessed. And as I mentioned, there's been a recent transition to standards. Frameworks, the old system was very qualification based. So you wanted to have a competency based qualification, people seeing that you could do the tasks you needed to do as part of the apprenticeship, and a technical qualification as part of that you could also get outside the context of an apprenticeship. But standards are occupation focused, and the emphasis is completely off qualifications. You don't have to get qualifications within that. And then assessment is at the end. It's not throughout the apprenticeship. Employers have always been involved in the construction of apprenticeships, whether they're being the old frameworks or the newer standards. But the perception is that they were not as involved in the old type of system, and it's a good thing to have them come together to develop apprenticeship standards. And the way it works is that the employers come together in groups of at least 10. If they want to develop a particular standard, they apply to the Institute of Apprenticeship and Technical Education. They have root panels, so they'll get somebody from those root panels in touch with the people that have applied, and that they'll work through the application process, and that's how you that's how you develop an apprenticeship standard. And I've just put some quotations to describe what the purpose of this is. They want the employers to define what the apprenticeship should be able to do. They think employers are the best placed actors to do that. And they call the groups of people who come together as trailblazers. And then in terms of the bodies that do governance and regulation, well, everything comes ultimately through the Department for Education, but there's been an Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. That's quite a recent body from another body. That's another thing that's always changing in England, that bodies that organise things change as well. But they have the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. They are responsible for standards, for the development, for their review and their approval. Then you've got an inspectorate that investigates the quality of training provision, the Ofsted, Office for Standards in Education, Children's Services and Skills. They inspect everything. They inspect schools, they inspect local authorities, and they inspect apprenticeships as well. Then you've got the other bodies that inspect qualifications, Ofqual and Office for Students, depending on which level we're talking about. So what are the implications of the approach? Well, on the positive side, you could say that apprenticeships are closely aligned to what employers want, who are organised enough to get themselves together and decide what they want. And they go through all this process, and then they end up with an apprenticeship standard that is close to what that group of employers actually wants. But the standards developed can be narrow and aligned with the interests of only a few employers, and progression is not built into the system explicitly. In some occupations, there's a structure for that, and not in others. So, for example, a kitchen assistant at level 2 would not necessarily be able to access a level 3 chef training or the qualifications associated with it. So that's a problem. And in our own work recently looking at apprenticeships, we found an apprenticeship for assistant puppet maker with no apprenticeship for puppet maker. So we just thought it was a rather bizarre example of what's been developed through the system. So the social partners actively involved in apprenticeships seem to be central government and employers. Other actors have a far more limited role. That's just the way it is in England. There's a proliferation of standards. Question is, are they training for a job or are they training for a career? It seems to be a little bit towards the job end because they are so specific, and the concern is when there is technological change, as there always is, digitization, climate change and everything, will what they've learned as an apprentice still have currency given their experience as well? Will it be easier for them? Will it be easy for them to make the transition? And I think this is an open question and something that needs to be discussed within England. And then as standards are developed in such a bottom-up way, yes.
We have only 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll wrap up. As standards are developed in a bottom-up way, there's a possibility that important areas are neglected, or public money is not directed proportionally to priority areas or to priority people. So there's lots of challenges, and I could go on, and I'm not going to, because I know we're out of time. So I'm going to say, I know that the presentation can be circulated to anybody who wants to know more. Other things that I've done is, despite all the difficulties with apprenticeships, there still is a return in the labour market to having one. So they're not totally useless. It might sound like they are, but they're not. For young people who actually, older people who actually get them, there is a return in the labour market. And I think a common challenge across many countries is that men and women do very different kinds of apprenticeships with hugely different labour market returns. And that is a important source of inequality in the labour market as well. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much to all the speakers for very interesting presentation and contributions. And what the different experiences have in common is the important role of institutions in this issue. Thanks to the audience for the attention, and now it's lunchtime.
So lunch will be served over here, and we have 1 hour. So we resume activities at 2 p.m. Yeah. Yeah. So you can also use the other conference room, for eating.